Good morning. It's May 11th. Just before we got on, I thought I could say, hey, it's May, and at least it's not snowing. But as I'm looking out the window right now, and if you're looking out yours around here in the 6th, no doubt you will see it's snowing. We've had a bit of a, hey, good morning, interesting spring, I guess we should say. At least as far as everything goes, it's been an interesting spring. So a little bit cold outside. A perfect morning, I suppose, to drink a cup of coffee and watch a candidate for the Pennsylvania State House talk about story on Facebook Live. So, good morning, May 11th again. We are getting close to the registration deadline, May 18th, if you know somebody who needs to register to vote. And applications for mail-in ballots, May 26th, though I would encourage anybody still interested in doing that, and I encourage you to be interested in doing that, to process that as soon as you can. Down here in Crawford County, the Crawford County Courthouse has been fantastic about processing those applications. Some of my friends have gotten their mail-in ballots within 3 days of requesting them on votespa.com, but the sooner the better, and sending it back in, the sooner the better. Something like 1 million people, it's a lot, in Pennsylvania have requested mail-in ballots because things are still quite a bit uncertain, despite what some of the rhetoric would tell you about that. But hey, we're not going to talk exactly about that today. We'll talk about story. Show you my ceiling for a second, as usual. I know that's one of the best things of the morning, is getting to stare up at the ceiling of this room. Oh, my rig is falling down. Okay, I fixed it. I almost had a technical collapse. Okay. Clear the workstation here in some ways. I'm going to start off, and I don't know why, this always feels a little bit awkward, but as you may or may not know, I'm a writer. It's one of the things that I do in this world. And my second book is called Appalachia North. And I say it's weird. There's something funny about publishing books, is that you're enormously proud of doing it, but somehow it also feels like telling anybody that you've done it is, arrogant. I don't mean it that way. So I'm mentioning this one today because it has a lot to do, in fact, with the candidacy. It's a memoir called Appalachia North. And I'll reference this, probably won't throw it back on the table again this morning, but I'll talk a little bit about how writing it helped me think about politics and story. That's what we're talking about here this morning. So the big theme is story, and we'll draw a little book here. We all read, or we hope we all read, or can. So this would be the story of Northwestern PA here, this little book. And if you recall back a couple weeks ago, I kept drawing this arc line. All right, so the Freytag Pyramid, which is a plot arc. We'll just put that here. Plot arc, or plot triangle. And I'm going to label this whole column over on the right-hand side here with this super fun term called narrative theory. I warned you that I'm a writer. But we talked about this plot arc and the way, as a reminder, that we have an inciting incident that sets a plot off that moves through a rising action until it reaches a climax, which is a point of change, and then releases in the denouement, or the falling action of a story. And I talked about motivations, and one of those motivations week had to do with all the things that make me angry. And then I talked about desire, which are largely related around ideas of hope and empathy, kindness, and a politics in northwestern Pennsylvania and the Commonwealth and the country, if we could get it, that thinks about this. And so when we're thinking about this review of the narrative theory, motivations are why a character does something. Desire are the internal mechanisms that cause characters to make decisions. There's two types of plots. I want to talk about them as theoretical and then also applied to politics and northwestern Pennsylvania. So there are bad stories. When I'm teaching creative writing, one of the things that one has to teach developing writers is that bad stories are built around predetermined plots. And by that I mean, and this is fiction, of course. I could work in nonfiction too, as we'll talk about in a second. But in a predetermined plot, we've actually already drawn that line. All right, so we've drawn that plot arc line. We've come up with a great idea. Think about any high concept action film. There's an idea. And then you drop your characters into that plot, but your characters, in fact, really are just little wind-up robots that don't do anything. They only exist, this is the wind-up key, if that's unclear. They're mindless. We'll give them a little nose, too. The characters exist only to walk the predetermined plot. These sorts of stories are not very interesting. This is the differential between garbage literature, in some cases beach reads, which are fun to read. They're comforting because you know what's going to happen because the plot is visible and predetermined, but the characters are wooden. The characters are artificial and unreal. Whereas in good stories, the plot is actually built out of decisions. And what you have in good stories are strong characters, real people. I'm chuckling at myself inwardly here. The good character of every story has a mustache and a Van Dyke beard. Good plots and good stories are built by characters who make decisions that actually alter predetermined plots. So desires are things that govern the decision-making of characters when they meet conflict. And how the characters respond to those conflict moments, how they make the decisions, changes the world. That's actually how good stories work, is that the plot is built out of an uncomfortable situation, decisions made by the character, and then it leads to a new world. So, okay, that's a quick review of narrative theory and how it applies. If we move over to the other side, what we want to think about are actually the plots that we live. And the first thing I want to draw is something that should be quite familiar to you, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And we can put ourselves up in this little odd gerrymandered squiggle of the 6th District. That's where we are right now. That's what we're talking about of politics. And there are stories that exist. One of them that I want to talk about, I said I probably wouldn't throw this back in, but I'm going to. Appalachia North. We have to think about this because it has a lot to do with the plot of the area. So if I draw this dotted line, I'm actually going to move to a different color for this. I'm going to move to this lovely green. This dotted line, oops, that's more or less straight. I'm going to make it less dotted so it shows up better. And it does something like this. This is not exactly to scale because I'm freehand drawing this, but you'll get the idea here. And then it extends down this way, and I'll crosshatch this so it shows up well. This is Appalachia, a term you may or may not be familiar with. You've probably heard it, and there is some disagreement in different parts of it of whether you pronounce this Appalachia or Appalachia. I grew up pronouncing it Appalachia. You may very well have done so too if you're from north of the Mason-Dixon line. If you're from south of the Mason-Dixon line, it's more likely you say Appalachia. And south of the Mason-Dixon line, people who say it Appalachia are actually met with a fair amount of suspicion. But anyway, this green shaded stuff is the margin, the official margin of what's called the ARC, which was officially designated by an act of Congress in 1965. It's the Appalachian Regional Commission. It encompasses 13 states. Some of them are the ones you expect when you hear the word Appalachia that come directly to mind. West Virginia, which is the only state that is fully ensconced in Appalachia. West Virginia, Kentucky, mountain North Carolina, some of the mountains of South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi, which you don't necessarily expect, Ohio, particularly southern and central Ohio, and then up into northeast Ohio, the border counties that border us. Almost all of Pennsylvania, this actually, I need to amend this. It actually goes more like that. Almost all of Pennsylvania, with the exception largely of the expansive Philadelphia zone, and then the southern tier of New York. These have been officially, by an act of Congress, since 1965, part of the ARC. The governor of Pennsylvania was a signatory to this ARC. Why is that important? Two reasons. One, Appalachia is a cultural region, and we're going to talk about that. But it's also a political region, not, well, in many ways. We can fork that off in two ways. There are mass amounts of funds available through the ARC. They are state-federal combo funds that are administered to work on various kinds of development in Appalachia, because it was recognized first by JFK and then signed into law by Lyndon Johnson as a poverty zone. And so the money that's available through the ARC, and we should be hearing more about ARC actions in northwestern Pennsylvania, I'll be clear about that. It can be used to improve roads, which has been very important in Appalachia, to improve hospitals and access to hospitals, to improve broadband, all kinds of things. Infant mortality has dropped in Appalachia because of the acts of the ARC, though this region also still struggles compared to the baseline demographics of the rest of the country. So there's a story, a predisposed plot. I'm going to call these ideological narratives that work on us in politics that we need to think about. And we need to think about how they relate to motivations and desire and whether things are real or not real. One, and this matters a lot to me, is that we are not Appalachia. There are some who would get very angry at the suggestion that we are. But the fact of the matter is that we lie in this region. We have been designated as such since the beginning of the region, and culturally even farther back in time. People will recognize that things are a little bit different in western Pennsylvania than in eastern Pennsylvania, and partly that's cultural. But when someone is spinning that, well, we're not Appalachia, they're working in a bad story that refuses to recognize and then therefore deal with some of the stories that really are happening. Our economic struggle, for example. Another story we're told that is an ideological narrative is that everything is about the economy, which is somehow different than the people who are living and working within it. Now, I'm instantaneously going to think about how that's a story that's related to being from Appalachia. One of the economic tales of Appalachia is about resource exploitation. In fact, those words, resource exploitation and that word exploitation, are literally in the ARC document. And there's some nuance to the definition of that. But Appalachia, since its beginning, has existed as a way, now I'm talking cultural and conceptual, as a way to pull the resources out of a region. So from the beginning, one of the realities of this, we'll put a reality here we need to think about, make it plural. The reality is that in like the first wave of Appalachia, it was recognized early on that it was rich in timber. And in order to get the timber that would benefit not the residents of the region, but the people who owned it, who were somewhere else, was to devalue the people living there. So that was the first effort. The second effort, this is an interesting one, it was actually missionary work. Missionary work that existed to raise funds for churches. They came into this region and they defined the people as godless. heathens, snake handlers. It was a way to create a stereotype that helped them raise money for their churches for their work. So whatever we think about the missionary work itself, we have to recognize that they were creating a false story and a false plot around the people that were in this region so that they could have it. And the last one is the coal, the natural gas, and the oil, which is a similar, well, actually all three of these are quite similar, but particularly similar to the timber, this idea that we need to exploit those resources and we become, the people of the region, become part of the landscape, the region. And so all of this equals, if we connect these two together, is a devaluing of people. Because we wind up, this is where I'm talking about story, we wind up having to walk a plot. We're made into this sort of robot that must walk a plot of resource exploitation, which I just smeared my ink over here, maybe that's artful, that makes it so that we don't count in the same way. Now, I'm going to link that to right now, that there's been a lot of talk, a discourse, a disagreement about what's better, opening the economy or keeping people safe. It's a very weird binary that's been created, and we have to recognize how everything that's happening right now with the ugliness that we're seeing of people disbelieving the governor and what he has done to keep Pennsylvanians safe, everything that's happening there is related to this plot that pre-exists because we're Appalachia and because we have been defined forever as people who don't matter as much as the economy. There are other people who do matter more than the economy. They're not the ones who are being asked or forced, thrown off unemployment effectively, to go back to work. Why am I talking about all this narrative theory today? Because we have to think about this important phrase. For me, at least, it's important. Is that this just calls for a colored pencil of some kind. We live the stories we tell. And I cannot think of a more political sentence than that. We live the stories that we tell. Politics is an act of creating characters and plot arcs and telling stories that dictate decisions that are made that impact our actual lives. So the way the story has shifted in the last 2 weeks, because people got tired of quarantine, the story shifted away from protecting lives into protecting the economy. That's not an aberration. That's directly related to all of this. That's directly related to the way we've always been treated in this part. Another reality we need to think about is there's another line here that we could draw, and I'm going to overlay it, something like this, kind of stretch down here too, which would be the Rust Belt. And so up here in District 6, we are a combo point of the Rust Belt and Appalachia. And there are stories that are told about that. But what we have to recognize, the reality is that the industrial decline has been going on for quite a long time. The industrial decline of the Rust Belt started in the mid-20th century. This isn't exactly news to you, I'm sure, but some of it is. If we look at population peak, there's stories that are told about Meadville, and that story usually centers around Talon Zipper, which was a devastating blow to Meadville for sure. But Talon Zipper left. Well, there's a whole cascade of things that happened. It really sort of started in the early 80s when it went into holdings, and then it was gone by the early 90s. But that's sort of told as the inciting incident. If you might remember this. We'll talk about this here in a second. Inciting incident. Left out an I there. It's told as an inciting incident of the industrial collapse of Meadville. But the peak population of Meadville was 1950. And the peak population of Erie was 1960, give or take. That's a slightly different story than what we like to tell when we have an ideological narrative of political nostalgia. Political nostalgia. What do I mean by political nostalgia? Pretty clear about that. I don't need to do much other, I think, than draw this hat. All right, that's political nostalgia right there. Make America Great Again is political nostalgia because the decline of industry, the peak of our region relative to the industrial story, was 1950 and 1960. And then there's been a steady drop with some more catastrophic drops. That has everything to do with the definitions of who matters and why. But we have experienced basically forever this dynamic of political nostalgia trying to spin a story for us. If we could just get back to those good old days, there are very few people working now who were working in the good old days because they were quite some time ago. The peak of Meadville from a population standpoint was when my grandfather was working, when my mother was 10 years old. My grandfather was working in Chicago at the time, not Meadville. We need to think about that. That gives us other stories, and the big story that dominates in how we MAGA it is related to this phrase that you probably have heard before, which is called supply side economics, or is more popularly understood as the trickle down theory of economics. And this can be defined very quickly as someone who perhaps makes a plank of their political career, no taxes ever for any reason. In particular, supply-side economics say that we need to cut taxes at the top, and that will somehow benefit everybody within the system. That is exactly what Appalachia has always been. Appalachia has always been a situation where the economy has been rigged to benefit the wealthy owners, largely who do not live in the area or the region, at the expense of the people. And if you know anybody who grew up in a coal patch, southwestern Pennsylvania or West Virginia, you know that it was not precisely prosperous to be in that situation. Those are supply-side economics, but it's a story we keep telling over and over again that even though we're experiencing a long designed austerity and negative impact based on generations of economic policy, we're told, well, if we could just give all the money to the rich people, we'll be okay. That's what supply-side economics, trickle down, and an absolute violation or absolute hatred of taxation in any way matters. Now, the other thing that we need to think about with story is how all of this bad stuff can be counteracted by personal stories. Because personal stories, not in the sense of some of the individuals who talk about a conspiracy theory and then say, hey, it's just my opinion and all opinions are equal. They're not. I'm talking about if we really think about individuals and what they're experiencing, we can think about more authentic desires and motivations to change the story. And so I just want to reference really quickly 3 for me that are related to the platform that I have. One of them was this brain tumor I've mentioned before that I came down with. It's a funny way to put it. I was diagnosed in 2016. This became a really personal way to think about the narrative of healthcare. Because here's another ideological narrative. The government sucks. All right. That's related in many ways to the supply side economics. By people who make their entire living from the government running campaigns over and over again on the idea that the government sucks. That's why we can't get health care. That's the story that's told to us of why we can't get health care. But if we actually think about the plot, boom, economy versus people. I don't know why I said boom there. That's what it is that I believe that the primary reason we have opposition to single-payer health care in the United States is because if people suddenly didn't have to worry about their health if they lost their job, they might quit jobs that are exploiting them. That no matter how bad your job is in this region, if it comes with benefits, you're tethered to it. That's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. We are being used as leverage for the economy. Our health is being used as leverage of the economy. So the expense of this brain tumor helped me understand how healthcare is a story that's being told one way that's actually functioning another way. The other one is related to the environment, and growing up as a kid and looking at all the lovely creeks. That's the wrong, I need a different color. I want to give you an authentic creek color that if you're from up here, you might not recognize as an authentic color of waterways in Pennsylvania. But when I was a kid, this was the color of water in the Toolik Creek, which I grew up in the Toolik Valley. Acid mine pollution created orange and red water from iron sulfate. Essentially, we had rusty water because we had the mine acid leaking out. This is a story of environmental impact that you see that is not the same thing as the economy at all costs. We see the impact of that. Or there was another situation when I was working on this. I said I wasn't going to do this, but here, I'll show it to you a third time. This book, Appalachia North, I was tracing the headwaters of the Toolik Creek with my father, and we were in this tiny little town. And there was this big pile of something that's called bony. It's a bony pile, which is the garbage of coal mining. There's some coal in it, but mostly waste, and it's not exactly good for you. And the bony pile was like right here, and there was a little road. This is in the middle of a town. And then right here was the town baseball diamond. That's a story, a real story about environment of people. This has been sitting there for years and years, like 40 years. What are you going to do with it? And then the last one that I'll tell is about education and this idea that if you've been educated publicly, that you're somehow inferior to people that have been educated in other ways. My wife used to teach at a small private K through 9 school. And there was a moment where one of the wealthy parents, who was a very nice person, but was lamenting a student's failure to do well and said, gosh, if this continues, they'll have to go to Penn State. And my wife and I both went to IUP for our undergraduate, which in that comparative elitism might suggest not being even as good as Penn State. But there's this idea that public education is somehow inferior. It's a personal story that's not true. But the economy has, this economic decision, decided to underfund these public educations. I'm built on public education. A lot of you are built on public education, and we turn out okay. In fact, we turn out amazing because public education has been a wonderful strength in Pennsylvania. So, to recap what I'm talking about today, it's this idea that anytime you're listening to politicians talk, you're listening to them actually describe stories. And we have been raised to think about ourselves and tell stories about ourselves in certain ways that actually yoke very closely to the tales of Appalachia. People think we're stupid. Right? This is part of being Appalachian. This is part of being from flyover country, or the pejorative term Pennsyltucky, which is an insult to both the great Commonwealth of Kentucky and the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Or there was a Democratic strategist who said Pennsylvania is 2 cities. Two cities with a whole bunch of Alabama in between, which is an insult to Alabama and an insult to individuals. those stories are being cast upon us, and when we keep electing officials that represent this in the same way, that actually present us as only caring about the economy, as being based on exploitation and being stupid, people are going to continue to think we're that way, and they're going to continue treating us that way. So that's the recap. So I see a question came through here. Yeah, I mean, this is from Tom Cagle, who says 2 questions. The second we'll ask later, but how will you explain this story to voters in the district without sounding like an out-of-touch academic? Well, first of all, in some ways, I mean, I appreciate that question, actually, Tom. I can be nothing other than an academic, and this may be an academic response to that. Partly what I want to break down is another binary of this story, is that thinking deeply is not something that we all do, because I think we all do it all the time. Ultimately, the way I break it down is this idea of the story, is the simple question of, do you matter as much as the economy? And I think it's pretty easy to talk in terms of this phrase, we live the stories we tell. Obviously, spending 30 minutes or so on it is going to come across as being a bit more of an academic way of approaching it. But that is a good question, and I appreciate it. I'm not sure if the second question will pop up here or if I'll catch it offline and then respond to it at another moment, watching my little screen here. So I'll give you a preview of what's to come here. We're only a couple of weeks now until the primary election. Next week, I'm going to move in a different direction and actually show you how to sketch some stuff. It will be a sketching tutorial on Monday mornings with Matt as we think about one of the big things, which is getting the word out about this election and the primary. So until then, Tom, I will keep monitoring this post, and I'll see your second question later, and I will respond to it in type on the Facebook page. Thanks for tuning in this morning. It is snowing still here on May 11th, which is maybe an encouragement for us to continue hunkering down and staying inside. I hope you're all safe. I hope you're all healthy. I hope you have some good books to read and think about the stories that are being thrown at you all the time, and whether you want to be a character in that story or be a character who writes your own. Have a good one.